My name is Patrick Kind. I have no proof of what happened to me in December of 1990, 24 years ago now, when I was 20 years old. I want to tell the story one more time before even more detail is lost to me. On a Sunday morning, I think it was about the 8th, I drove my old Datsun for hours into the mountains of West Virginia to this place as remote as I'd ever been, a very small town called Grenza, about 30 miles east of Elkins. I'd booked a room in an old bed and breakfast for a couple of days during winter break from college. My favorite thing to do back then was head off somewhere all alone with a couple of books, just disappear for 2 days or so. I was too young and dumb to cancel the trip, even when I got a weather report for Grenza and the surrounding area that was promising significant snowfall. The last hour and a half of driving was all isolated mountain roads, and by noon the car was slipping because the snow was packed hard on the pavement. I was getting really worried, but I'd reached a point where going back seemed it would be as dicey as going forward, so I just pushed on. The last 10 miles, it took me 45 minutes to travel. I was scared to go any faster because I was afraid of wrecking. It felt like I was the only one on the road. I saw 2 plows going in the other direction. That was it. I barely realized it when I entered Grenza. It was settled by German woodworkers in 1855 or so. It was as deep in the mountains as I'd ever seen a place. There were a few houses nestled off a small curving road. That was it. There wasn't even a town per se. I spotted the bed and breakfast, but it was down a steep driveway. I overestimated my Datsun's capabilities, and halfway down it, I lost traction completely. I started to slowly angle, and all I could do was turn in the direction of the skid until I came to a nice, soft rest about 15 feet off the driveway. I'd have to deal with getting out of there on Tuesday morning. I didn't want to think about it just then. The woman who had called for a reservation had told me to walk over to the adjacent house where she actually lived and where the restaurant was. It was just up the hill. Her name was Laurel. She was about 70, I'd say, pretty amazed at how young I was. I knew I was the only guest that weekend, but Laurel told me my isolation would be more intense than I even thought. The old couple who ran the post office a few hours each weekday and opened up the historic mill and printing press house for tourists on weekends, their names were Bill and Bev Dietrich. They'd suddenly left a few days before, just left. Technically, Laurel and I would be the only people in the legal town limits of Grenza that weekend. Its population high point had been back in 1970. Their population had been 130, and now there were only 24 residents. And aside from Laurel and the Dietrichs, they all lived much, much further down Acorn Road, not even in walking distance, really. Laurel sounded kind of distressed when she broke the news about the Dietrichs' departure. Her summer helper was gone, so she would make my breakfast and dinner. I thanked her and I trudged through the falling snow over to the little house I'd have all to myself. It was an old thing, cold, in disrepair. Here's the most telling statement about the condition of the place. It had no locks, not on the front door or anywhere else inside. Laurel had meant to restore them, but she never got around to it. And it wasn't like anyone was going to break into this place. She told me if I wanted privacy, I could just put a chair in front of the front door and she would know not to come in. That's what I got for trying to choose the absolute cheapest place I could find. I went up the creaky steps, I threw my backpack on the bed in my bedroom, and I looked out the window down at my poor car. Then I looked up at all that white nothingness in the sky, and up at the rows and rows of trees to the north. I could see the tops of mountains far, far away, just visible through a mist. Something happened to me in that moment. It had never happened to me before. Maybe you know the feeling I got. I'll try to describe it. It came all at once, the sense that something was very wrong here. and that I'd made a terrible mistake. I was farther away from my world than I'd ever been, and that was okay. But what wasn't okay was my feeling that I'd come at a bad time. Grenza looked dead, but secretive somehow. Who knew how medical help got up here in a snowfall like this, where the hospital was, where the police station was? I looked around and I saw that there was no phone, though I'd spotted one at the main house, of course. It seemed to really let up snowing as I was staring out the window. It was going to be ghastly cold that night and the next day, too, so I decided that if I was going to go for any kind of conservative hike while I was here, it would have to be now. I stopped in at the main house to ask Laurel if I could maybe get a sandwich to tide me over for the next few hours. She was sitting in a rocking chair very close to the front window, looking out over Acorn Road with a very worried look on her face. She actively tried to talk me out of walking any further than the mill. There were bears here sometimes, and people got lost. She was extremely persistent. Finally, she went into the kitchen, so dejected I was left to feel like I was abandoning her. While I waited, I looked around the front room. Every inch of wall space was covered with old paintings and hangings. By the looks of them, mostly done by local people. There was one very clumsily done watercolor hanging low and out of the way at the back of the room. It caught my eye because it was so strange. It was a view looking down on Grenza from one of the mountain slopes that surrounded it. In the foreground was a trail of footprints in the snow. They were moving away from you, and they just sort of ended. The painting actually had a caption. It was also printed in watercolor, in black, all capital letters, toward the bottom. It read, "Walking people, go back." Laurel came out of the kitchen, wrapping up my sandwich, and I asked her about what that meant. She seemed to think about that for a long moment before she answered, like she didn't know whether she should talk about it. She dug that painting out of storage only a few days before. Her son had done it when he was 16. He lived in Montana now. All she said was that no one in Grenza wanted to see the walking people ever come again, and that she put the painting up sometimes when it felt like they were watching or they were near. The silence sort of drew out. After that, I decided not to ask her anything more. Obviously, there was some senility here, something I couldn't deal with. I thanked her for the sandwich, and I told her I'd be there for dinner at 5:30. I headed down something called Wildberry Lane, which branched off Acorn Road toward the woods. I walked past the historic mill and the little old house where the region's first printing press had been housed. Neither had been operational for more than 50 years. I moved my scarf up from my neck to the bottom of my face, and I wondered how long I could last out here. The clouds above me were moving quickly across the sky, and I forgot exactly what that meant, but they looked dark and thick. The road wound around to the right, and the downslope got steeper and steeper as the woods crowded in. It dead-ended after about a half a mile, but not before a short trail branched off it to my left. The trail was only about 40 yards long, and there was a sign there marking something called Bachmeyer Cemetery. The sign looked so old that I thought the graves themselves might be of some interest, so I decided to check it out. By now I was breathing pretty hard as the cold stung my lungs. The cemetery was built on a fairly dramatic slope, and as I suspected, most of the graves seemed very old, a lot of the tombstones tilting askew. I walked among them for a bit, reading random names and dates, a lot of German last names. The most recent death seemed to be 1980 or so. The little place was sadly pretty somehow, lying under the snow. I stood there and tried to appreciate the solitude, the incredible clean air, the sense of history. But it took a conscious effort. Even the cruel grayness of the sky made me feel uncomfortable, too isolated. At one edge of the cemetery was a monument off to itself, about 5 feet high, standing beside a tree. Someone had paid a visit recently. There was a large wooden crucifix plunged into the soil in front of it, and some kind of wreath had been just leaned against it. The wreath was extraordinarily strange. It had been crafted carefully from ivy and pine in a fairly traditional way, but there was something else woven through it. I had to touch it to confirm it was real. It was the skin of a long snake, an actual snake. And here was its head at the end of it. Its eyes had been removed. Whatever kind of snake was common to these parts, I supposed. At first I didn't think there were any letters on this monument at all, but it was just an illusion of the snow clinging to them. I brushed some of it away, and I read these words: "So that the walking people may not come often." Nothing else. No attribution. Leaving the cemetery, that feeling came again. The feeling of being woefully out of place, unwelcome here. But now there was something else. I felt a genuine fear of everything around me, of what might be in the woods, in the cemetery, on the silent road. My body was sending me signals that danger was near, but it had no single source. I wanted to run back down that path toward Acorn Road, but I forced myself to walk and not panic. That trudge back up Wildberry Lane was steep and painful. The thought that I should get out of Grenza right now was irrational, but it was persistent. Twice as I went up the hill, and then a third time, I looked back at the spot where the path led into Bachmeyer Cemetery, and I was certain somehow that someone was about to appear there, following me. I tried to tell myself that this sudden plunge into isolation was responsible for every bit of this panic, but I knew there was more to it than that. My skin was tingling, and I just stopped for a moment when the mill came into view. I tried to settle myself. There was a house behind the mill, built on the adjoining property. I'd noticed it before, but now something about it really stood out strongly. From where I was standing, I had a good view of the front porch. There were 3 wreaths hung on the railing, spaced a few feet apart from one another. And they were obviously identical to the one I'd seen in the cemetery. I cut around the mill and actually stood on the lawn of that little house, trying to make out the name on the mailbox. Yes, the name was Dietrich. Gone now, this older couple. I didn't know why. Left suddenly, Laurel had said. By the time I got back to Acorn Road, my ears and fingers were numb from the cold, even under my hat and gloves. I checked on my car, resting awkwardly sideways on the sloping drive. It started just fine, but as I suspected, the wheels just spun and spun. It was going to take someone giving me a serious push just to straighten out, and after that, I'd have to gun it up the slope and hope for the best. But there seemed to be no one here who could help me. No one. Up in the unreserved bedroom that was down the hallway from mine, I sat for a while, and I just stared at the window at the 2 houses I could just barely see up Acorn Road. There was a for sale sign in front of one, and the other was just shuttered. I decided to go to my room and sleep until dinner, get under the covers and just calm down. As soon as I began to drift off into those warm quilts, I heard an engine, what sounded like a small car out on Acorn Road. And that made me feel a little bit better. When I woke up, it was dark. I wasn't sure at first what time it was. I knew only one thing, that I was scared. While I'd slept, something had turned for the worse. And how that sense had worked itself into me, I don't know. But I didn't even want to move from the bed. I was afraid to turn on the light. I was afraid of what I might see if I did. For 10 minutes I just lay there wondering why I was coming apart, and then I forced myself out of the bed and onto my feet. I walked back down the hall to the unreserved bedroom, and I looked out the window, where Acorn Road was now lit feebly by street lights that left long patches of the road barely visible. Not the slightest sign of human presence. Even the thought of crossing the property to the main house was dreadful to me, stepping out into the dark and the cold, all alone. I was going there now for one reason, which was to call for a tow truck. After doing some mental calculation, I figured that if I gave the driver all the money I had, he might agree to tow me all the way back down to Route 219, where the road would certainly be clear enough at that lower elevation to safely drive far away. I had no intention of spending the night here, with the thought that by midnight I'd be going insane with the feeling that the town around me was closing in on me. I was simply going to abort this whole trip, and I could laugh about it and make fun of myself from the comfort of my home, hours away. It had become bitterly cold, and the wind had picked up. I narrowed my eyes to slits as I ran up across the property to the main house, slipping a couple of times, almost going down in the snow. It seemed like there was only one light inside the main house, the kitchen light. I crossed the porch and I found the front door still unlocked. I went in and I shut the door fast behind me, shivering. The front room was dark. I called out Laurel's name and I didn't get an answer. I walked down a short hallway and into the roomy kitchen where that lone light was. A clock on the wall told me it was 8:15. 8:15. Somehow I'd slept for 5-6 hours. The spotlessness of the kitchen told me no one had been in here preparing dinner, expecting me to come over at 5:30. I walked back into the front room, knowing what I would see if I looked out the window, and I was right. I'd asked Laurel before if the light pickup truck that had been parked out front had been hers, and she'd said yes, and now it was gone. A fact I hadn't registered with my head down against the wind a few minutes before. She'd left me alone in Grenza. I was now the only one here. Of this there didn't seem any question. There was a phone in a little breakfast nook, and the yellow pages were right there beside it. The line was working fine. The first towing service I called told me there was no way they could get me out unless I could wait till morning. Their 3 trucks had been pressed into service already, plowing Route 33, which led west to Elkins. But I got lucky with the second. This guy, Bill I think his name was, he answered the phone and he was willing to come out himself for the price I offered, and he would get me exactly where I needed to go. He said he didn't think it would be a problem to get to Grenza by 11 or so. I thanked him and I hung up. More than anything, I wanted to keep talking. I even considered making more calls to see if I could somehow find someone who could come get me right now, but that seemed like it would be too much a shot in the dark. Walking back to the front door, I saw the note on the end table beside it, folded in half. It had my name on it. Laurel had written it. It said, "Mr. Kind, I'm sorry I've left. I've gone to my sister's house in Morgantown. I called to you from below your window, but you didn't answer. She'd left, with her only guest waiting for dinner. She'd left on dangerous roads in freezing cold to drive to a town 90 miles away, leaving no number. I wrapped my scarf around my face and I opened the front door again. As I ran from the front porch across the drive into the other house, I toyed with the idea of even making a call to the police, telling them I'd had some kind of accident or fallen or something or hurt myself. I'd claim an injury, a crime of some kind, anything to get me out of here. I could say I hit my head in the slide I took in my car. I could do it. But I knew I would hate myself for my collapse into paranoia. The second I got inside the little house, I slammed the door behind me and I leaned back against it, breathing hard. There was nothing to do now but wait. In a few hours I would be out of Grenza and safe, as if there were truly anything sinister here. I didn't like all the lights on suddenly, and I didn't want to go back upstairs. I had the insane thought, the sadomasochistic thought, that the creaking of the stairs would tell whatever might be above me that I had returned, that I was coming back into the bedroom. I couldn't stop thinking this way. I turned off the lights, and I sat in the middle of the couch that sat facing Acorn Road. It felt better when I was in the dark. I felt hidden from what might be outside. I had a nice wide view of what was out there. This was exactly where I'd stay waiting. The thought that kept rising unbidden in my mind was, you are completely alone. You are completely alone. I need to describe the scene exactly here. Acorn Road stretched from left to right in front of me, a little more than 75 yards from the edge of the property. The near side of the road was clear. The far side, the background, so to speak, was mostly trees except for an empty field where Laurel had told me she picked flowers for the guests' breakfast tables in summertime. The street lamps were bent from age and the constant oppressive wind, shining down on the road, which was just a sheet of white, an inch of snow and ice packed onto it. That snow whipped down and swirled every time there was a wind gust. This was all framed by the big picture window before me, in the dark living room. Some time before 10, I developed a ringing in my ears which wouldn't go away, and my head began to throb. I started to suffer a phenomenon from books I'd read, which I had thought was just fictional convenience, and that was my hands beginning to shake. I looked down at them with kind of detached curiosity. It was like they didn't belong to me suddenly. There wasn't anything I could do to stop them. 10:15, 10:30. That was when it happened. I saw a man out there, moving into view on Acorn Road out of the blind spot to the east. He was walking very slowly and heavily right down the center of the road, looking straight ahead. He had a beard, I remember. His clothes were archaic. They were not of this time. And he wore no coat, no hat, no scarf. He looked pale, so pale. Behind him came another human being, also walking with that strange motion as if they were both just lost and didn't even feel the cold. This man was looking up at the sky as he walked. When they talk about farmers or blacksmiths of past centuries, that was what he was wearing. Exposed like that in this cold would have brought on frostbite in minutes. A woman came next, one of the tallest women I'd ever seen, and deathly thin. Her hair was blown all around crazily by the wind. She was wearing a long, dark gray or black dress. I saw that there was nothing on her feet at all. At all. They seemed unaware of each other somehow as they moved. And then there was one more, a man who had no arms. Otherwise, he was just like them, and he moved just like them. And now the first in the procession was out of my sight line, having moved down Acorn Road. They were oblivious to what was on either side of them. They seemed to want only to keep moving forward. The second they were all gone, I felt something unlock inside me and I could move. I got up swiftly from the couch, wiping the sweat off my face, and I turned and I almost ran up the stairs. I moved down the dark hallway and I entered my bedroom. I closed the door and I backed up to the edge of the bed and I sat on it. But I swear, it wasn't 10 minutes later that I heard that door open down there. It came to me very clearly. I heard the wind come in, and I didn't hear the door close again. I didn't hear it shut against the frame. I moved to my window, the one overlooking the back of the property. I unlatched it, and I pushed it all the way up. 2 inches of snow had collected around it, and some of it blew into the room. I dragged the desk chair near me over, and I climbed onto it. It was going to be a tight squeeze to get out, but I did not hesitate. I maneuvered my torso out onto the sloping roof, putting my hands right down into the snow. My hat and gloves I'd taken off when I'd come in. They were downstairs. I hoisted myself up, twisting, so that I had to face the starry sky above me as I squeezed out. The slope was dangerous only because the roof surface was so slippery now. I held onto the window as long as I could. By the time I swung my legs out, my backside already felt frozen from contact with the snow through my jeans. Lying there on the roof, almost at a 45-degree angle, I propped myself up just enough to be able to slide the window back down, and then I rolled 3 feet to my left, and on my back I waited, staring up at the sky, resting my head back. I couldn't even turn it to keep an eye on the window because to do so brought my cheek in contact with the snow, and that was just unbearable. I guessed that I could wait maybe 10 or 15 minutes like that before I absolutely had to climb back in. It was torture. The wind seemed twice as strong up there. It became an awful test of endurance as the minutes went by. Tears were frozen on my face and my fingers were numb. My ears stung. Finally, I did turn my head to look at the window. My angle wouldn't let me see into the room, and it was too dark in there anyway. At the absolute extremity of my endurance, the window slid up its frame. 2 inches. Then it stopped. I made my decision instantly. I pushed myself frantically down the roof toward its edge until the ice took over and made me slip helplessly downwards. I struck the gutter hard and there was a burst of pain in my hip. Thinking back on the structure of the house as I dimly remember it, I was lucky to jump where I did at a point low enough so that I hit the snow hard and lost my balance, but I broke nothing. I caught most of a bush as I landed. My first attempt to stagger to my feet failed and I collapsed, too dizzy to keep my balance. But then I found the strength to run, limping badly. The slope that led down to my car was too steep to navigate in my condition, so I covered the last 20 yards, scrambling on my hands and knees, barely in control. My keys were in my pocket. I stood leaning against the car and got the door open. I sprawled low across the front seat and I slammed the door shut again, locking it. I had no intention of trying to start the car because I knew I was stuck. So what I did was lie face up on the front seat, my head below the passenger's side window, seeing a sliver of night sky high above me, and nothing else. I was wheezing. My lungs were in agony. Headlights washed over the car before I'd even begun to settle down. I heard the rumble of an engine coming very close, and I leapt up, scrambling to unlock the door. The tow truck I'd called appeared at the top of the slope, and instead of the darkest scenario coming true, which would have been the driver going past, unable to make out the address or seeing no sign of human presence, he stopped right where he should. I clambered out of the car, and I made my way up the slope, telling myself that there was no need now to tell him anything more than he needed to know. I looked at the house, and I saw nothing out of the ordinary. The front door was closed. I think I almost sounded normal when I thanked him profusely for coming. He said I was welcome to sit in the cab of his truck, where it was warm, while he went about the business of dragging me out, and I followed him to it. Tilting my head up as I went, I could not see the other side of the house and the upstairs window I had climbed through. As I got into the truck, he asked me if I'd been in a fall. I said, yeah, a little one. As he set up the tow outside in the wind, he was never more than 20 feet away from me, so I felt secure. That one human presence wiped away the fear. I was thankful that he kept his engine running, because it created this intrusive sound of activity and industry. It crushed the silence in Grenza. But I never stopped scanning the world outside the truck's windows. Acorn Road was empty and snow-blown. The woods in the distance were dark. The wind bent the trees gently. That one light was still on in the main house where Laurel lived. When we got up the slope, dragging the Datsun, and pulled onto Acorn Road, my eyes went to its surface of packed snow and ice. We began to drive in the direction where those people had come from. I saw no footprints in the beam of the headlights. We left Grenza behind. I asked the tow truck driver where he was from. Mongoose, 30 miles south. I asked him if he'd ever heard of a local legend, the Walking People. The answer was no. 2 days after I was back, safe at home in Annapolis, I called the bed and breakfast. I got no answer. Nor did I get any answer a week after that, or a week after that. I vowed to drive back to Grenza as soon as there was no chance at all of bad weather, even the slightest possibility of a sudden snowfall. But life got in the way, and my spring vacation plans changed. And that summer I transferred to Ohio State. I told the story many times to many people over the years, starting with my father as soon as I returned from Grenza. I suppose I wanted someone to believe me so completely that they themselves would drive there and see what I'd seen. But no one ever did. Maybe there were just one too many details that left themselves open to the slight possibility of a normal explanation. Could it be that nothing I'd seen on Acorn Road was, in itself, provable as supernatural? Could the hands that pushed up my bedroom window have belonged to someone I just didn't realize was in Grenza? Once in a while I'd meet someone who'd heard of Grenza and maybe pass through it without much of a story to tell. As the internet grew, I occasionally tried to find more information about its local legends. I never found the slightest thing of interest. 1 or 2 photos of that monument. That was it. It wasn't until last summer that I drove back, more than 2 decades after that long winter's night. I had my wife and teenage daughter with me. They knew the story, and they were sort of excited to go on this exotic detour from our weekend trip to see friends in Pittsburgh. The main road had actually been rerouted 7 years before, though, so the trip was longer and more circuitous than ever before. There was no one left in Grenza now. Acorn Road hadn't been repaved for a very long time, and the street lights had been taken away. Laurel's house was still standing, but it was for sale. and the one where I'd stayed for just a few hours had been torn down, and so had the house of the Dietrichs. The mill was still there, but not the building with the printing press. We parked in what was now just another patch of country road, not even a town. And together we all walked down Wildberry Lane toward Bachmeyer Cemetery. It was a beautiful sunny day. My daughter listened to pop music on her headphones, and my wife commented on how pretty it all was. The sign that marked the cemetery came into view. Nothing had really changed on that hillside. Someone was still maintaining it very occasionally, and the strange monument was right where I remembered it. Seeing it for the first time in 24 years brought back a vivid sense of how cold it had been when I'd seen it, how my ears had stung, how young and reckless I'd been. I like to believe that those words on the monument proved to my family that it had all happened the way I said it did. The wreath, woven few with snakeskin, was gone. So was that wooden crucifix. My wife asked me if I wanted her to take a picture, but I said no. I thought we shouldn't do that. It made me afraid somehow, the thought of challenging the walking people in that way. We walked back to our car, and we drove away.